like to start?
Surely. One of the events that I'll never forget, and was the start of the next tragic years, was the winter of 1932-1933. It was an exceptionally cold winter, colder than many winters before. And the city of Mannheim, my hometown, ran out of coal. They had to heat the official buildings and schools. And so right after having enjoyed Christmas vacation, we were told that the city had agreed a coal vacation, 2 weeks of vacation between January 15th and January 30th. Well, that didn't make us unhappy at all, you know. And a few of our friends, about half a dozen of them, we got on the phone and said, how are we going to use this time? And one of my friends, Eric Böhm, said, I found out that snow conditions in the Black Forest are just fabulous. Why don't we go to the Drum Mountain in Black Forest, in the Jugendherberge, which is a youth hostel, and go skiing every day? Well, that was great. I went to my mother and said, would you let me go for 2 weeks? So I said, what are the financial ramifications? Well, I said, Jugendherberge, 50 pfennigs a night, and we're going to do our own cooking. No charges for skiing, you know, because the mountains are free. And there was an easy sell. She says, fine, just make sure you don't break any legs. So we went, and we had a wonderful time. And it was powder snow. We had this old equipment, you know, the old skis with old traps, you know, bindings, but we had a lot of fun. There was no one else around except we 6 boys, and did our own cooking. And the way we arranged it is, one guy couldn't ski in the afternoon, and he had to cook for the rest of us, you know. And I remember, and we had very simple food, like spaghetti and soups and so on. Not anything elaborate, but a lot of it, and healthy. When it was my turn, I never forget, I decided on lentil soup, because I watched my mother make bean soup, lentil soup, pea soup. We had a lot of, I loved soups. And so I made lentil soup. And, you know, I put all the ingredients in, I cooked it slowly. And I wanted to make very, very sure that this was going to be excellent. And so while this thing was cooking, I tasted a little bit, you know. And the lentils were still hard, and then they got a little softer. But what happened to me is, because I ate these lentils when they were still hard, they bloated in my stomach. And so when the other boys then in the evening ate this excellent lentil soup, I was deadly sick because of my tasting it before the lentils were soft. So I never forget that one. So we had a wonderful 2 weeks, and the last day of vacation, on the 30th, we bid farewell the Black Forest. And the Black Forest isn't just a forest, it's a mountain region south of Mannheim, you see. On the one side of the Rhine is the Black Forest, and the other side is the Vosges Mountains on the French side. So it's not flat, it's quite mountainous, so, and good for skiing. We were on the train, we were singing, very happy after 2 weeks. And when we got into Mannheim, and the train stopped and we got out, and we had the first view of our hometown. We were stunned. There were Nazi flags, the swastika flags, all over town. It was an ocean of flags on every building, and we were stunned. Without saying a word, we hardly said goodbye to each other. We grabbed our skis and our rucksack, and made our way home. When I got home, my folks informed me that this very day, Chancellor Van Hindenburg, had turned over the office of Chancellor to Hitler, to Adolf Hitler. And this was a day of what the Germans called the Machtübergabe, the transfer of power to the Nazis. The next few months were dramatic. As you probably know, Adolf Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf that one of his goals was to wipe out not just the German Jews, but Jewry all over the world. That he was going to be very radical about it. And he proved this very quickly. Every few weeks, a new decree came out in Germany. Jewish doctors were not allowed to work in hospitals anymore. The German population was not allowed, the non-Jewish population was not allowed to go to Jewish doctors. Lawyers were not allowed to go into court anymore. Things like this came about and completely destroyed the social economic basis of the Jews in Germany.
What year was this?
I beg your pardon?
What year was this?
This was 1933. And now to give you some perspective, Mannheim was a city of 350,000 people, and of those 7,000 people were Jews. And the Jews of Mannheim were known to be very prominent in culture. More than 50% of the medical people, the doctors, were Jewish people, and so were the lawyers. And while this is something you're proud of as a Jew, it was resented by those who were anti-Semitic. And so very quickly there was the economic pressure on the Jewish population was very, very heavy and strong. Now, what happened in school? Within days of being Hitler being in power, the professors came to school in uniform. And many of my classmates belonged to the Hitler Youth, which is brown uniform, too short pants, red band, and they came to school in uniform. Now this is a little bit of, it's intimidating, you know. We were only 2 Jewish boys in a class of maybe 35 students. So things were not pleasant anymore. And then came that fateful day when Professor Klein came into the class one morning, and this was in July 1933, and he announced that the Ministry of Culture and Education of our province of Baden had agreed that whenever the professor came into class and when he left after class, after an hour, the students got up. That was habitually done anyway, but instead of just getting up, they would render the Hitler salute, Heil Hitler. Well, the next day, as the professor entered the class, everybody stood up, everybody saluted Heil Hitler, except my friend Eugene and I. So the professor looked at us and said, Epstein, Fischel, don't you remember what the instruction I gave yesterday? Yes. So why don't you render the Hitler salute? My pal said, can't do it. And I said, sorry, can't do it. He got very mad, he stormed out, and within minutes we were told to go home. The janitor of the school came to my house with a written notice that a hastily convened conference of all professors had decided that we had to be dismissed from school. Well, obviously the Gestapo was notified, or the Gestapo was in one way looking into affairs in schools, because my mother, who was somewhat sympathetic with what I've done, refusing Hitler's salute, sent me shopping because my father was furious. You know, my father thought I should have complied. And being sent shopping was the best thing that could have happened to me, because while I was shopping, a man who identified himself as a Gestapo official came to my father's door and asked for me. And so my oldest brother hunted me down and intercepted me while I was shopping. He gave me some money and said, Kurt, get out of town, go to Cologne to this uncle, or get out until things have cleared up. You know, the Gestapo is looking for you. And this might not mean much to you, but the Gestapo, the Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret police of Germany, were Hitler's tool of doing incredibly bad things. And so anyone who was not a Nazi feared them greatly. I was 16 years by then, you know, and I got out of town in a big hurry, went to relatives and who were very nervous, giving me even a refuge for 2-3 days. But you must understand that when you move in Germany from one place to another, you have to go to the police and say, I'm Marie Werft, and I come from this city, I'm coming to this city here, and you have to fill this out. And when you leave, you have to go again and fill out that you're leaving, you see. And so the whole population was controlled. This was not an invention by the Nazis that existed before, you see. And so some of the people I stayed with were pretty nervous about my being there, even as a visitor. You know, they knew I was being hunted. And so I tried to make it easy on them, but also to be safe. I never stayed longer than 2 or 3 days. At one period, now here I'm a teenager running all over Germany, you know, sometimes in strange cities, sometimes out in the country. At one time I was in Cologne when I found a gardener who wanted some help. And I worked for him for a few weeks, you know, and I lived someplace in some rented room. I didn't get paid by him, I just got my free lunch with his family. At some other time, I worked on a farm in the Odenwald, which is a mountainous area in southern Germany. There was a lonely farm, and the road ended in the mountains. You couldn't go any further. And that lonely farm, I worked again for weeks, you know. Nobody knew about me. I worked for this farmer. He was glad to have some help. He didn't pay me anything. And I had some meals, which were very meager, mostly potatoes. But in general, I just was on the run, you know. I did stay in contact with my home, but not directly. There would be friends or acquaintances in different towns that would call acquaintances for my parents. And these acquaintances would come to my parents and say, Kurt called, he's safe, he's in Stuttgart, he's in Hamburg, and so on, you know. So there was some contact and some reassurance both ways. Of course, my parents were highly nervous. And this was, of course, aggravated by the fact that the same Gestapo man came day after day to my father's jewelry store and said, has Kurt shown up yet? And my father honestly told them, or my mother, whoever was there, we don't know where he is. Okay? That's quite a situation. At one time, I went across the border between Germany and Holland. There was a highway, and you know, and there was a barrier across, you know, and there were customs officers and so on. When I saw this, I did have a passport, but I went around and went through the woods, and I went across the border in the woods because the German officials would have snapped me up, no doubt, you see. And so I went into Holland, and in the first town I was glad to be in a country where you didn't see any Nazi uniforms. However, I walked only 10 or 20 minutes on the street, and I looked like a real German boy. I had short pants, I had a rucksack on my back, you know, which is, you see it all over Europe, but typically, you know, the Germans much more so than anybody else. And 2 policemen stopped me, show me your ID. I showed him my passport. He says, you're German? What are you doing here? I said, I'm running away from Nazi. No, you're looking for a job. Now you must realize that at that time, in those years, the economy of Europe was very bad. And each country was very astute not to let young people from other countries in because of jobs, to protect jobs for their own young people. So these two policemen, very kind but very firm, escorted me to the next railroad station, put me on a train back to Germany. So I ran again from town to town, from all over Germany. Now we're not just talking days or weeks now, we're talking years, you know. I was like a hunted rabbit. And one day I made it, trying to get out of the country, I made it into France. Now at that time it was not too hard to get into France because of the closeness of Germany, of France to the southern part of, you just had to go across the Rhine. From Freiburg you were in Strasbourg, you see, and somehow I managed to get into Alsace-Lorraine, into France, and I made my way across France, hitchhiking, and a lot of young people hitchhiked, and I was very fortunate that I was not caught by police there. And I got to the English Channel, and I went on a ferry, and I went to England. Landing in Dover, in the interview by the immigration officer, that English immigration, is another thing I'll never forget. What do you want to do in England? I said I want to learn the English language because I want to eventually go to America. I've learned Latin, I learned French, but English I haven't learned enough to get a job when I get to America. You know, I wanted to improve my English. Well, where will you stay? I said, well, I will probably go to a rented room in London. What school would you go to? I remembered seeing a brochure of Masterman Smith's School of Languages, and I mentioned that to him. Well, that impressed him, you see. Do you have any means to sustain yourself while you're in London? I said, oh yes. I didn't have more money than for one day in my pocket. Well, there's something nice about the English, much nicer than the Germans. And I could see the reluctance, but he gave me a stamp in my passport that allowed me to go, to get into England. He said, by the way, you have to present yourself once a week to the immigration office in London, and we want to make very sure you're not taking a job. I said, fine. Okay, I took the Southern Railroad from Dover to London, which was an experience. I was out of Germany, you know. I was in England, and it was all new to me. And I arrived at Victoria Station, and I said to myself, now Kurt, you're in England, in Victoria Station, what next? Well, you have to stay overnight someplace. Right? So I went to the telephone book, and I was very hungry. I looked for restaurants first. I found a restaurant, and I had people show me what bus to take to get to this restaurant. Fortunately, it was a very modest restaurant. It could have been a very fancy one. I couldn't have afford even an hors d'oeuvre, you know. So I seated myself, know what to order, you know. I didn't know anything about English food, and I saw people at the other table eating something that looked pretty interesting to me. So when the waiter asked this German boy, he didn't know much English, what he wanted to eat. I said, the same thing. So he brought me, this was beef pot pie. You know, there's a crust over it, it's delicious. So I learned beef pot pie. For the next few weeks, night after night, I ate beef pot pie because I knew what to ask for. But I didn't eat in that restaurant, in different other places. I was told to find a rented room. You look in the windows of drugstores and there are cards where people write down room to rent, apartment to rent. And I found one and I took the address, I took the bus and I found the address by asking a lot of questions. It was 2 Goldhurst Terrace, London Northwest. I remember the number and the steps. I rang the bell and a woman, very lively, in her early 30s, opened the door and says, "Yes, what can I do for you?" I said, "Room for rent?" "Yes, come on in, come on in." She introduced herself as Mrs. Tuppence, and I introduced myself, with a lot of hand language. She showed me a room, and it was, I think, 4 shillings a week or something like this. It was ridiculously cheap. And breakfast was included. And there was a sitting room where you could sit at night and read the paper. And Mrs. Tuppence explained to me very early that she had thrown her husband out because he was an alcoholic, And so I had a room, and there was a gas burner in the corner with you injected a penny or tuppence or threepence, and then the gas would burn for a length of time, I never forget that system either. And now you probably wonder, where did I get the money? Well, we did have family friends that had international business. They had retail stores in France and in England. And from time to time, I got money from them. I did go to Masterman Smith Institute to learn English. In order to save money, I had very little money. I used the bus as little as possible. I walked all over London. If you wanted a guide for London, I think I would qualify, because I walked from Trafalgar Squares to Kensington Natural History Museum of History to Buckingham Palace, all over the place, in the West End, where you have the theatres and where you have the fine stores like Selfridges and so on. And I went to Hyde Park Corner, especially on Sunday, where you have those soapbox speakers. And I was amazed at the English allowing men to get up on the soapbox and talk about how bad the royal household is, and we ought to get rid of them. And there was a bobby standing by, and the bobby didn't arrest this man, With my German mentality and coming from